By 1942, while Germany's cities trembled under the weight of Allied bombs, America's factories were roaring to life. The United States had barely entered the war, yet in a matter of months it transformed from a peacetime giant into an unstoppable war machine. Detroit, the arsenal of democracy, where once sedans and convertibles rolled off the lines, now came Shermans and tank destroyers. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant, built by Chrysler in record time, was unlike anything the world had seen. Its assembly lines stretched for hundreds of meters alive, with sparks, motion and sound, steel plates clanging, welders hissing, engines thundering through final tests. Each day, dozens of new tanks rolled out uniform, reliable and ready for shipment overseas. By the end of the war, this single plant alone had produced over 22,000 M4 Shermans. Across America, other factories joined in. Fisher Body in Cleveland, Pressed Steel in Pennsylvania, Baldwin Locomotive, Works Pullman Standard. Together, they created a storm of metal and firepower that Germany could never match. While German factories struggled with shortages, sabotage, and relentless bombing raids, American plants had electricity, raw materials, and most importantly, safety. They ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's what some German POWs couldn't believe when they first saw them entire cities working in unison to feed the front lines. For men who had grown up under the iron discipline of Nazi militarism, what they saw in America looked like chaos workers, laughing, eating together, listening to jazz or baseball while welding a turret. Yet the output was staggering. It wasn't just production, it was rhythm, a national pulse, an industrial miracle powered not by fear but freedom. When German prisoners of war were shipped to the United States, most expected humiliation, barbed wire, hard labor, and endless punishment. What they found instead was something they couldn't comprehend. In states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, a select group of POWs were assigned to civilian labor projects near factories, including the very plants that built America's tanks. Some worked on rail lines, hauling steel, others cleaned assembly floors, and a few even handled non-sensitive transport duties inside manufacturing zones under guard. At first, they stared in silence. They had seen factories before, back home in the Ruhr in Hamburg in Saxony, but nothing like this. The scale was overwhelming. Endless conveyor belts carried tank hulls like clockwork. Cranes swung turrets the size of small houses through the air. Women, thousands of them, riveted, welded, and painted with precision. Men who'd never seen a battlefield, worked as if the war depended on every bolt they tightened. To the German prisoners, the most shocking part wasn't the machines, it was the attitude. There was no screaming overseer, no fear of punishment. People smiled, joked, shared food with them. They were even allowed to read American newspapers under guard, supervision, and saw stories of tank deliveries reaching Europe faster than they could imagine. One POW later wrote in a post-war memoir, "I realized in that moment that Germany could not win. The Americans built tanks the way we built bicycles." Another described his disbelief at seeing replacement engines piled high like cordwood, enough to power an entire panzer regiment. "Back home," he wrote, "we melted down church bells to make tank parts. Here they threw away what we would have killed to keep." What struck them most wasn't the material abundance, it was the freedom of it. No secret police, no ideology painted on the walls, just workers' tools and an unspoken confidence that they would win. For the captured men of the Wehrmacht, it was a revelation and a quiet breaking point in their belief in the Reich. The phrase came from Franklin D. Roosevelt himself, the arsenal of democracy. But for those who witnessed it, the name wasn't just political poetry. It was literal. By 1943, over 85,000 American factories were producing war material, from bullets to bombers, from rifles to rolling armor. The sheer scale of coordination was unprecedented in human history. The Detroit Arsenal ran 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Freight trains lined up outside the gates, waiting to haul tanks to ports. By the time one shipment left, another batch was already being fueled and tested. At night, the sky over Detroit glowed orange from the foundries, a constant industrial sunrise. Inside, the choreography was perfect. Turret rings lowered into place with a clang that echoed like thunder. Tracks rattled across the floor as welders worked in sparks. Every movement was timed, every step refined. And unlike Germany, where tank models were constantly redesigned and retooled, America focused on simplicity and volume. The M4 Sherman wasn't perfect, but it was reliable, easy to fix, and easy to build. That meant one American plant could produce in a month what a German. A factory might take 3 to finish. Even the supply chain was an engineering masterpiece. Steel from Pittsburgh, engines from Detroit, optics from Massachusetts, and rubber from Louisiana, all arriving like clockwork. Every component had a place. Every delay had a backup plan. When the German POWs saw this for themselves, it shattered the myth they'd been fed. Back home propaganda told them Americans were weak, lazy, soft, that the German spirit would always triumph over material might. But here in front of them was proof of the opposite. Efficiency without cruelty, discipline without fear, and power without tyranny. And perhaps most humbling of all, it was ordinary citizens doing it. Housewives, mechanics, and farmers who'd traded their day jobs for welding masks and overalls. The war machine of the United States wasn't built by soldiers. It was built by the people, and it never stopped. While American factories roared through the night, German industry was gasping for air. By 1944 Allied, bombers had reduced the industrial heart of the Reich to rubble. The Ruhr Valley, once the pride of German engineering, was little more than a maze of twisted steel and smoking ruins. Inside what remained production was chaos. Fuel was scarce. Electricity, unreliable, and skilled labor had been conscripted or killed. Tanks that rolled off German lines in 1944 were masterpieces of engineering, but they were fragile, over-designed, and slow to build. A Tiger tank required nearly 300,000 man-hours to construct an American M4 Sherman, barely 10,000. While one German Tiger prowled onto the field, 10 American tanks were already rolling toward it. German engineers, desperate to keep up, introduced new models. The Panther, the King Tiger, the Jag Tiger, each one larger, heavier, and more complex than the last. But every change slowed production further. The factories simply couldn't keep pace. Meanwhile, in the United States, workers celebrated record-breaking milestones. Tank number 10000 was paraded through Detroit with banners and music. Whole towns felt connected to the war effort. In contrast, back in Germany, citizens worked under air raid sirens, rationing food and fuel with no light at the end of the tunnel. Some German POWs who saw America's industrial stability later recalled feeling an almost existential despair. One said, "It was not the tanks that defeated us. It was the machines that made the tanks." They saw efficiency, that one wearer seemed almost effortless. They saw a nation that could replace in 1 month what Germany lost in a single battle, and they saw why, despite their courage, despite their training, despite every tactical success, they were doomed, because while Germany built monuments of steel, America built an army of factories. As months turned to years, many of the German prisoners settled into life in America. They worked, earned small wages, read local newspapers, and in rare moments even spoke with their guards about the war. Some of them were engineers or mechanics before they wore uniforms, and they couldn't resist studying the machinery around them. They marveled at the assembly lines, the standardized tools, and the easy access to raw materials. One wrote years later, "It was like watching an entire people act as one enormous factory." But beyond admiration came something else. Doubt. Doubt about everything they had been told. Inside Germany, propaganda painted America as decadent, divided, and weak. Yet here, prisoners saw something very different. a free society whose citizens volunteered to outwork an empire. They saw racial and social diversity functioning imperfectly but together. They saw women working shoulder to shoulder, with men laughing, while rivets flew and sparks danced in the air. It wasn't the image of decay they had been taught to despise. It was vitality, a democracy in motion. When some POWs returned home after the war, they brought that memory with them. They spoke quietly of what they had seen of factories that ran like orchestras of people who built because they believed, not because they were forced. Many of those former prisoners would later help rebuild West Germany, inspired by what they'd witnessed in America the Marshall Plan gave them. The tools, but the image of that tireless humming production line gave them the model. For others, the memory was bittersweet. They admired what they had seen, but couldn't forget what it meant that their own country's downfall was inevitable. From the moment America awakened its industrial power, to them, the war ended not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. By the final year of the war, the cold arithmetic of production told the story better than any speech or propaganda ever could. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced over 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany built barely 25,000 in the same period, many of which never even reached the front lines due to fuel shortages or destroyed railways. For every German aircraft that took to the sky, America built more than 4. For every artillery piece the Wehrmacht rolled out, the US had 10 in reserve. And when it came to vehicles, trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, the numbers were almost absurd. The US produced over 2 million motorized vehicles. Germany, barely 300,000. It wasn't just quantity, it was quality of logistics. An American Sherman might not outgun a Tiger, but it rarely broke down. When it did, spare parts were waiting identical, pre-tested, boxed and shipped. German mechanics, in contrast, struggled to find compatible components, sometimes cannibalizing wrecked tanks to keep a single one running. American soldiers fought with radios in every tank, hot food from mobile kitchens and fuel that flowed endlessly from overseas convoys. The German army fought with dwindling supplies, rationed ammunition, and vehicles that often couldn't move for lack of fuel. When captured, POWs were shown American production graphs and logistical data. Sometimes in re-education programs near the end of the war, they were stunned. The numbers confirmed what they had seen with their own eyes, that they had been fighting a country that treated war like an engineering problem and solved it. No amount of bravery, no tactical genius could overcome that kind of momentum. For Germany's soldiers, the realization was devastating. They hadn't just been beaten, they had been outbuilt. For many German POWs, the moment of realization came quietly. It wasn't a speech or a headline, or even the sight of an American tank rolling off the line. It was the sound that steady, unstoppable. The hum of production that stayed with them. One former prisoner later described it as a sound that never ended, day or night, like the heartbeat of a giant. Another said he could still remember the vibration of the ground as rail cars, loaded with tanks, departed for the East Coast. We watched them vanish toward the horizon, he wrote, and we knew that each train carried another defeat for Germany. There was no bitterness in their tone, only awe. They had seen something their commanders had never wanted them to see. The full collective power of democracy. When united under one cause, what struck them most was how calm it all seemed. No marching, no slogans, no flags, just quiet competence, ordinary citizens doing extraordinary work because they chose to. Some POWs even admitted that if Germany had possessed that same unity of purpose, not through fear but through belief, the outcome of the war might have been very different. But instead, they had been chained to ideology while America had been driven by innovation. Years later, when historians interviewed returning POWs, they spoke of their time in captivity not with hatred, but with a strange respect. They had glimpsed the engine of a different kind of power, one that fought not just with tanks and guns, but with ideas, systems, and freedom. When they finally boarded ships back to Europe, after the war, many looked over their shoulders at the coastline of the country that had defeated them, and some whispered, Now I understand. Because they realized the truth that every tank, every shell, every ship had already proven beyond doubt. They hadn't lost to an army. They had lost to an idea. By the time the last German POW ships left America in 1946, the Detroit Arsenal and hundreds of factories like it had already begun shifting back to civilian life. The welders traded torches for tools. The assembly lines returned to cars and tractors, and the endless roar of production faded into memory. But for the men who had seen it firsthand, both the Americans who built it and the Germans who witnessed it, that memory never left. The war in Europe was often told through battles, Normandy, Stalingrad, the Bulge. But beneath every victory lay the steady pulse of industry. Every Sherman that rolled across France, every plane that soared over Germany, every crate of ammunition on the docks, all of it came from that invisible army of workers who never saw the front lines, but shaped its outcome all the same. The German POWs who glimpsed that world saw something deeper than machinery. They saw a nation that had mastered the art of organized freedom, power without tyranny, strength without fear. And in that realization came the quiet understanding of why their side could never prevail. Because in the end, the war wasn't only about soldiers or strategy. It was about belief in an idea strong enough to build, adapt, and endure. And as the last tanks rolled out of Detroit's factory gates, the echoes of hammers and engines carried a message across the Atlantic. That freedom, when harnessed with purpose, could outproduce any empire built on oppression.